Thank you everybody for still being here. I know we're kind of towards the tail end of this conference. So today I'm going to be giving a talk about a recent project that I completed looking at modeling mosquito abundance in Dallas-Fort Worth, which is a metroplex in Texas. You have to excuse the super lengthy title. It's just the title of the paper that this is based off of. So there's this not very funny joke, and an old joke at that, that goes something like, how do you know somebody's from Texas? And the answer is that they'll tell you. So this is me telling you, because that's what we do. I'm a Texas Tech alumnus. My undergrad is in math. I'm currently a second-year MPH student in the Epi department here at UW. And as you might have been able to glean from the presentation title, I'm a big mosquito guy. So I do public health work, but mostly that's sort of like the natural extension of the vector control stuff that I'm really passionate about. Usually, I think if we were to kind of take a poll in this room, when we think about regions of the US that have mosquito problems, kind of the first answer is it's not much of a problem, right? We're not sort of at a lot of the mosquito work, especially here at UW, is on the global scale. And when we're thinking domestically, we're usually thinking of the super humid areas. We're thinking Connecticut, kind of the birthplace of a lot of this mosquito surveillance stuff. And then Florida, right? They've got a dengue case, feels like every single week. And so those are really where we place our attention in public health. But Texas has its fair share of issues as well, unfortunately. Starting in 2010, we had a West Nile virus outbreak. And so as public health tends to operate, we reacted based off that. And so every single year, the Texas DSHS, which is the Texas version of like what we have up here in the Department of Health, has started doing these yearly reports where they give out maps that have counties that have positive mosquito pools, which is just sort of a jargon way of saying they sampled mosquitoes that tested positive for West Nile virus. But for those of you that are a little more aware about mosquito-borne disease, you might be thinking, well, this is a presentation about Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, and they don't transmit West Nile virus. And yet, both of these species are very prevalent, not just in the US, but in Texas. So these are just maps that I grabbed off of the CDC website. They're very outdated, but they're the most updated information that we have. And you can already see that both of these species are well established in Texas. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the panhandle of Texas is no longer in the unlikely or likely range. We have both of those species in the panhandle. And so this is sort of where the disconnect between public health researchers and public health agencies really comes into play. As researchers, right, there is a lot of value in having traps for species that aren't posing an active public health risk, which is what you can kind of consider Aedes aegypti and albopictus to be in Texas. They're the guys that transmit dengue, chikungunya. Aedes aegypti transmits yellow fever. So very kind of scary diseases, but from the lens of a public health official and maybe somebody in a county within Texas, you're thinking, well, they're not transmitting these diseases currently. Vector control does not get a whole lot of funding to begin with, especially so in a state like Texas. And so they're going to divert all the resources they can into the active threat, which for Texas is West Nile virus. But not only is my research interest within these two species, so it's kind of a selfish project in and of itself, but to some degree, and not to be melodramatic, right? If we are not actively surveilling these two species, we're sort of looking at like, well, I guess we're just waiting for disease transmission to start, and then at that point, how well equipped are we to actually deal with it? And so this project was looking at using the West Nile virus surveillance systems in Texas to predict and kind of examine the abundance of these two species and the distribution within DFW. DFW, let me just, so the two, you can't really see it too well. Hopefully you can see my cursor. But this region right here is where the metroplex is. It's comprised of over 200 cities. And so the data set that we had started in 2013, went all the way to 2022. It's this really interesting area to look at from a vector control perspective, because so many cities within DFW are getting a whole bunch of funding in a very short time frame. So for example, Plano, Frisco, and Carrollton are 3 cities that used to be within the lower range of median home income. But I can tell you that the median home income in Frisco before the Dallas Cowboys practice facility was built was a lot lower than it is after it was built. And so these things are the types of things that we want to look at as they relate to mosquito abundance, and were the reason why we chose DFW specifically. But of course, this is observational data, and it's real data. So there are a ton of issues, and this is just one of the very many examples I could have chosen from. So the yellow marker that you're seeing at the top is for 222 Lake Ridge Drive, right? That was sampled twice in our data set. 2 weeks later, we had a whole bunch of observations for 222 Lake Land Drive. If you try to find that on a map, it pulls up 4 different markers because it's not an actual address. And so we're having to do this trade-off of like, when we're data cleaning, is this a real address? And if we don't think it is, then do we delete it? Do we say that it's probably 222 Lake Ridge, so we're gonna just deal with whatever implications are there? But there were a ton of those issues. And so we started with 400 sites. We cut it down to 74. And you might notice that in Dallas County, which is the box on the right, there aren't very many sites. And so you might not be surprised to find out that we got a very interesting phone call from Dallas County public health officials once we were circulating this manuscript, because they wanted to know what happened to all of their trap sites. And so we essentially had to have that very awkward conversation of, there's valuable data there, but we're not very confident in it. And so there are only so many things that we can do when we're trying to do model predictions in terms of like, how low confidence are we willing to go in terms of data when we're processing? And so vast majority of sites are in Tarrant County, which is sort of an important thing to keep in mind as we go through this. So some of the covariates that we wanted to include in our regression tree model, as the title said, we used a random forest model. Super flexible, very robust. Like was mentioned in the previous presentation, out of the box, it performs very well. We did a good deal of hyperparameter tuning, which is like its own separate thing. But the covariates that we wanted to include right off the bat were some socioeconomic factors, which we got from the American Community Survey, which is done in 5-year increments. And these, the packages that we use to get this information are in that kind of italicized font. Of course, we wanted to include climate and meteorological data. Those are sort of just standard for any kind of abundance modeling effort. We used Prism for our climate data. There are all sorts of APIs that you can use, but we were most familiar with Prism. And actually pretty recently, they made their 800 meter resolution data available. You can't access it through the package yet. You have to build a web scraper to get it, but they have information on how to do that on their website. We used OpenMeteo for the meteorological data, pretty basic land cover stuff. We wanted to look at impervious surfaces and just sort of built environment indicators. And then basic mobility, we used OpenStreetMaps for that. And this was sort of like the throwing darts at a board and seeing like how weird we could get with the covariates that we were including. We did some stuff where we wanted to proxy socioeconomic status by like within a 100-meter buffer if you had a public library around your site location, because most of these sites were in residential neighborhoods. And so it was just kind of us trying stuff out. The vast majority of that stuff did not make it into the model, except for road density, which I'll have code examples for. So just to kind of illustrate, I know I'm like preaching to the choir a little bit here about how accessible this stuff actually is. Like, you don't need the fancy software to do it. You can just do it in R. And I think there are a whole bunch of reasons to do that. First of all, like I said, it's not super complicated. In this example, all we're doing is calling the tidy census API and getting, I'm sure there's a more efficient way to do this, by the way, getting it for the entire country, and then we're cropping it to our spatial extent, because it's a whole bunch of data that we don't need. Turn that into a raster, and then you get your point estimates around a buffer. For all of our buffers, we used 100 meters, because that's the kind of, it's the daily flight range for both of these species. So census data is super easy to grab. It's a little bit messier for like road density. This is ugly, I won't lie. It's a little ugly. But the real nice thing about having this is that, you know, we've all heard kind of ad nauseum that you're not able to reproduce a whole bunch of results that you see in the literature. And so if we're being this transparent about even the covariates that we're extracting and how we're getting those covariants, it allows us to sort of help in that transparency, because everything is spelled out for you, right? If the functions themselves don't really make sense, you comment that stuff out, so that way, if anybody wanted to just grab this code and apply it to their own data set, they can do that without a whole bunch of issues. So for model fitting, right, I gave this presentation back in March, or one similar to this. And as soon as I got into the nitty-gritty of model fitting, I saw everybody's eyes just kind of glaze over. So I'm not going to get into it here. I'm going to be hand-wavy about the model fitting and the results. And I will refer you to the paper if you actually want that information. Because the model fitting itself was sort of a challenge, a huge challenge for us. Actually, I was finishing this manuscript up whenever I first got to UW. And so I should have put a picture up, but my student ID, like when they took the picture, was when I was still writing the manuscript, and you can tell because it looks rough. One of the main results that we included in the paper was this comparison between observed mean counts, and these are on a log transform scale, and predicted counts. And so the point of this is to sort of illustrate that the trends that we're seeing in abundance between the observed and the predicted are more or less matching up. If you're wanting to see like our MSE information, again, that's in the paper. But model estimates were actually surprisingly good given the nature of the data set that we were giving in the first place. And then from there, right, as was mentioned a couple times in the presentations before mine, there's spatial autocorrelation in this data. When it comes to ecology-related stuff, there's always going to be some level of spatial autocorrelation, but that sort of drops off at a certain point. It's not going to be the same for both species, though. So we had a model for each species, and so when we interpolated on those results to get information outside of those trap sites, which of course are point data, we applied this mask function, which is, like you can see that in the grayed out portions of the maps, because those are sort of low confidence. And the real important map here, though, is the one on the right. And so that is showing the ratio between Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. One of the weird things that we saw in the actual data is that Aedes aegypti had seasonal dependence or seasonal dominance over albopictus, which runs kind of in opposition of what we consider to be like, or our understanding of the population dynamics. Aedes albopictus is considered to be at a competitive advantage. And so, right, what this ratio is showing is that these two species are sort of finding their own niches within the environment of DFW, which is very worrying, right? If you just are dealing with albopictus, which is a huge pest in and of itself, that's a problem. If they're coexisting, that is an entirely different problem in and of itself. And then we can get these partial dependence plots from model results. What this is showing kind of broadly is how model predictions are being impacted by increases in your covariates. So we have population density and poverty percentage are the two that I want to pay special attention to. These aren't the only variables that we had, of course. But that inverse relationship was really important for us to emphasize. And in terms of like policy-based conclusions, going back to the funding issues that I mentioned about these surveillance systems, it is going to be impossible to go to Texas DSHS and say, we suggest you throw a whole bunch of traps out there and see what sticks. But if we can point to, okay, you're worried about Aedes aegypti in Tarrant County, maybe you should target locations that are of higher population density and you're seeing a higher poverty percentage than otherwise, right? That allows them to sort of pick and choose their battles, so to speak, and say, okay, we'll do a couple of traps in these areas, we'll see if we find anything, and if they find something, then they can think about expanding surveillance efforts. So yeah, in terms of takeaways, right, policy-based conclusions had to be mostly restricted to Tarrant because of the spatial distribution of those traps. We just didn't have very many traps within Dallas County. And then in terms of relationships between abundance and covariates, we really emphasize that deforestation, a rapid increase in urbanization, and that's across the entire metroplex, and climate extremes are creating opportunities for these two vectors to coexist in their own environmental niches. And then, of course, right, spatial analysis in R is super doable. And I won't lie, it takes a ton of patience sometimes, and some storage space for the amount of packages. I think in total we use like 35 different packages for this project, but it's worth it, I think. I want to pay special thanks to the data managers, of course. They had to have a lot of patience with us, and they trusted us with a whole bunch of data, which we really appreciated. And then, of course, my co-investigators, Joseph McMillan over at Texas Tech and Luis Chavez at Indiana University. And then I'm going to shamelessly plug the paper. Go check it out if you want more information. Thank you, guys. Okay, we have like 1 minute for questions if anybody has any questions.
I have a question. What accounts for the lack of confidence that you had on the east side of the study area, Eastern County there?
In terms of...
Why was the data so unreliable? Like, what is it that they were doing differently in that county?
Yeah, so Texas and Washington actually do surveillance in very similar ways, which was very surprising to me. In that, like the Department of Health, or for Texas, the DSHS, they don't actually control the traps. They don't place any traps. They serve as an inventory for all of these traps. So the counties themselves will place the traps down and then send it to DSHS to inventory. And so that means that, because that was a question that we had, and they essentially told us that Dallas County, they do a whole bunch of nuisance trapping, which is just a resident calls in and says, I'm seeing a bunch of mosquitoes in my backyard. Can you place some traps down? So they'll have a trap down for like 2 weeks. They won't find anything and they'll take it away. We also have the military putting some traps down. They didn't tell us why the military is placing traps down, but that is happening. And so it's really just the fact that it's super decentralized, I think. Yeah. Thank you, guys.